Hey, Happy New Year's. Happy New Year's Eve.
New Year's Eve to you. This is our last podcast of the year.
Yeah, that's
How
right.
you like that? I was trying to think about how many we've actually done this year. And other than Christmas Eve, I think we only missed one other one.
Yeah. It would have
So
been probably a race weekend that I'm thinking of that for
yeah,
some reason one of us must have been traveling.
I think we may have done 50 episodes this
Yeah, that's pretty good.
this year. That's pretty solid. The fact that we keep coming up with material makes me feel pretty confident that we can continue this on.
Well, I'm going to brag a little bit on this because actually I take a lot of these videos and I post them for my class. And I
Right.
post them just for what I call immersion videos. So, it's either physiology of endurance performance or biomechanics of endurance performance. And the students watch them, but they don't watch them for necessary class content. They're watching them more for how do you apply class content to real world. And the things that we've talked about have been so complex. We're not focused on biomechanics, physiology, this or that. I mean, they're very holistic approach to understanding performance. So the reason why I'm bragging is I got my course evals back, and I had several of the students comment that they really enjoyed these podcasts.
Really?
Yeah. So I thought that was nice. I'd share that with you.
Wow, that is super nice.
Yeah.
And I know that that's not why we're doing this is for that, but it makes you feel good, right? That the students are actually enjoying what we're talking about. Because
Yeah.
John, it's really interesting. We talk about some very nebulous topics, but it all really is real world stuff in
Hmm.
the world of triathlon
Hmm.
um, that I think can make a difference. I mean, we've done a lot of like myth busting. We've done a lot of
Yeah.
ideas, or we've had a lot of ideas on like better training and better things to do. We've done stuff on equipment. I mean, we've really done a lot of really cool stuff.
Yeah, but what's interesting is one of our top viewed episodes is the Ask Us Anything one. So,
Yeah, maybe we need more of those, right?
yeah, yeah.
Very,
Well, I
very.
think that speaks to people have questions and where do you go for answers? Because there's so many places to go for information, but you go to five different places and you ask one question, you're going to get five different answers. And so it's hard. It's hard to navigate all the information that's out there.
No, you're absolutely right, and it seems like a lot of times, like when I go and look at information, there's bias out there. There's a lot of bias out there. Not that we don't have bias,
Hmm.
but there's also it's marketing,
Yeah.
right? There's a lot of marketing going on, and obviously you and I are not marketing here. We're just talking
No.
triathlon, and
We don't have any sponsors.
we don't have any sponsors. Not that we wouldn't take some if someone wanted
That's right.
to sponsor our podcast.
Yeah.
But I think that makes a difference, right? We're just a couple of real world people
Hmm.
that we think about these things to help us personally become better triathletes, or the people that we know become better triathletes. That's what I've always looked at this. Like the
Well,
way that we're giving advice to our friends.
and spot on. And your expertise in the clinical world and sports injury, that's huge as well. And, I actually, my career all started because I wanted to figure out how to go faster. And that's where I started coming across research papers and then ultimately wanted to figure out how to do the research as well. And I think that's the other thing that we have is we can look at a research paper and understand the strengths and weaknesses of those and what information you can pull from it, because it's not always easy. You can't always even take the author's conclusion from that paper. You have to sometimes really dissect it and pull it apart to really try to understand what information you can apply to real world settings.
No, you're absolutely right. It's yeah, because a lot of the times the papers themselves, the conclusions aren't what the research actually
Yeah.
says.
Yeah.
Um, and because maybe it's not the sexy part of the
Mhm.
of the data, right?
Mhm.
And the other thing, and we've talked a little bit about this before, which really bothers me in science, is it's really hard to get things published if there is no conclusion,
Yeah.
right? If we didn't find an effect, if hey, we're going to do polarized training versus a pyramidal
Hmm.
training, and then the results say, well, there's no difference. Well, then nobody wants to publish it,
That's right.
right?
Uh,
And it doesn't end up on any blog, or it doesn't end up in any, because it's not, it's not groundbreaking.
no, that's actually a great point. I'm glad you brought that up because that's a publication bias.
Yep.
And journals are notorious for not accepting articles where you don't show an influence of whatever it was that you were studying. And so now you go, you scratch your head and say, well, wait a second. If we do 20 studies and we get, whatever, 8, 12, whatever, that don't show a difference on something, but you only published a small number of studies that are showing a difference, well, now we're not even getting the complete picture. So
Yep.
this is a challenge in our research world.
Yeah. Yeah. And it makes it super hard for, well, I'm telling you, super hard for clinicians and super hard for like athletes
Yep.
and coaches that are trying to educate themselves,
No.
right? Because they don't know what is not being published.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Or even sometimes I know this to be true, that even people doing research, if they don't find significance, they don't even try and publish it.
Yeah. Right. Right.
Right? Like, oh, there's no significance there, so I'm not even going to try. And we
Mm-hmm.
don't see that.
Mm-hmm.
And so then how can we as consumers make decisions? The paper we're going to talk about tonight, the coolest thing about it, or one of the coolest things about it, was there wasn't much there.
No, that's right. Surprisingly.
Surprisingly, when you sent it to me, and just so everyone knows, sometimes John sends me a paper, sometimes I send him a paper, sometimes we have Vernice, our content curator, come up with papers. John sent me this paper, and I was like, oh my, this is like right up my alley. I can't wait to read it. And I've read through it twice. And like, it's really interesting that we have a what I consider a really good paper that
Yeah.
doesn't really show a whole lot.
Mm-hmm.
But that's like that's the take home point of this.
Yeah. Right. No, you're right. And I like that. Let's start with the take home point
Yeah.
of this is
Let's
okay.
talk,
So
let's talk about the paper to begin with. So what it is.
okay. Well, and maybe we even take a step back further than that. Our topic tonight, we decided was going to be cycling injuries.
Yep.
And so we're on the precipice of a new year. So today's New Year's Eve. And so everyone tomorrow will start their training program afresh.
Yep. And injury free.
That's right. You will automatically be injury free January 1, 2022. And then the whole trick with having a great 2022 is staying injury free.
Yeah.
And so what we wanted to talk about, because we know a lot of people are going to be ramping up training right from the get-go, is we wanted to talk about injuries, and we came across this paper for cycling injuries.
Yeah. So the paper's title is Factors Associated with Overuse Injury in Cyclists, a Systematic Review. And I know we've talked about systematic reviews before, but basically, in a nutshell, a systematic review is a review of the literature. And it's a review of basically all the known literature at this time. And this is from December 2022. And I think it's actually December 29th, 2020, or 2021, sorry. December 29th, 2021. So this is like 2 days old.
Yeah.
It's hot off the presses.
That's right. It's not actually in the journal yet. It's when is it targeted to come out? Because this is pre-proof. And so the actual paper will maybe a slightly different than what we're reading, but that's more copy editing at that point.
So this is in the Journal of Science and Medicine and Sport. And unfortunately, this one is behind a paywall. So you can't get the full, if you wanted to follow along, you can't get it full without paying for it, or being an employee of the UNLV.
Yeah, that's right.
We both are, so we were able to read this. But the idea behind this paper is looking at what causes, at least in the research, what causes overuse injuries in cycling.
Mm-hmm.
And so, John, before you read this paper, if someone was to ask you that question, because I get this all the time as an athletic trainer, right? Well, what caused the injury?
All right. Well, let's and I know we've done this in some of our podcasts, but we've got to probably do it over and over and over again because it's a really important point is what's an injury and then let's dissect them into or put them into either acute or chronic, because
Yeah.
the injuries, that come to mind are collarbone, broken collarbone, road rash, maybe head injuries, but that's not what we're going to talk about tonight.
Right. We're going to talk about the chronic injuries, the things that are, from repetition.
Mhm.
Um, you know, yeah, basically everything else other than like, hey, you fell down and you injured yourself. These are the ones that in cycling, you're riding along and your foot hurts.
Yep.
All of a sudden it hurts and you pedal a few more strokes and it hurts a little
Yep.
bit more. And then you go home and you don't do anything. And the next day you start riding and it doesn't hurt anymore. But then an hour in, it starts to hurt.
Right.
That's that's an example of a chronic injury.
Oh.
And so what this paper was trying to get at was, well, ultimately, what causes the chronic injuries?
Yep.
And the interesting thing is that there's very little good research on this.
Mm-hmm.
And we were discussing off the air of how difficult this research is actually to do.
Yep.
Because if you're going to do a traditional research study on this, that would be a prospective study where we'd actually take two groups and separate them and have them do something, one group do something, one group do something else.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the only outcome here is where we got to get somebody injured.
Yeah.
Right. And that's a hard thing to do. So, and these injury numbers are relatively low. So I think the numbers were cited like in non-professionals, it was 3 injuries per 1,000 hours. Right. So it's not, so it takes a lot of people. You have to have, think about like the biggest triathlon, and you'd have to basically take everyone training for that biggest triathlon and pull everyone out. Mm-hmm. And ask them, like, not even ask them, set it up before, like, are you injured to start with? And all these other factors. And it almost becomes an impossible task.
Yeah. It's tough. And so, yeah, this is the end of the year. So everyone should have their Strava, year summary. Maybe take a look at how many hours you were biking. Yep. And see how many injuries you probably should have. If we're predicting it correctly, 1,000 hours equal, the 3 different injuries. So, 1,000 hours of cycling. I should have looked at my numbers ahead of time. That's
a lot of hours.
Yeah, that's
3 hours a day.
Yeah. So that's 5 to 8 weeks of good solid cycling. So
straight.
Yeah. Right. And okay, so we've got acute and chronic injuries. Acute is not what we're going to talk about. Everyone's fallen. There's 2 kinds of cyclists: those who have fallen and those who will. So those who crashed and those who will. So everyone crashes. Everyone, the first time you get clipped in pedals, everyone will fall because you can't get your foot out, and you reach out and you hit the ground, and you could actually have a shoulder injury. That's acute injury. And we're not going to go into those. The chronic injury, yeah, it's repetition. Well, and most people will ride at 80 RPM, cadence of 80, 90, maybe some down at 70. So if you go for a 100-minute ride, just a little longer than an hour and a half, that's 8,000 revolutions with each side. So that's 16,000 revolutions. You're going over and over and over and over and over again. And so that's that chronic cause of an injury. It's a repetitive nature. It's not a single force or a single thing that's happening. It's just accumulation of this repetition that ultimately is coming into some overuse injury, whether that be the knee, the back, shoulder, numbness is hand, feet, and private parts. So
hips, ankles, feet.
Yep.
The thing with it is that there's pretty much nothing that escapes us. Necks, there's been a lot of people, especially time trial, people with neck injuries, upper back strains. So these are the type of injuries we're going to talk about. And let's go back to the acute versus the chronic one last time. If someone asks you what caused the acute injury, it's really easy. I fell off my bike.
Yeah, right.
Right. It's pretty, I couldn't unclip and I fell off my bike. Easy. The chronic injury is very, very difficult. Mm-hmm. So, most of you know that, I'm a certified athletic trainer, and I've spent a lot of years working with athletes on chronic injuries, and they're super difficult to deal with. Believe it or not, like in the world of athletic training, physical therapy, sports medicine, the acute injuries are really easy.
Yeah.
Someone breaks their leg, boom, we're going to put you in a brace or a cast. 6 weeks later, your muscle's going to be a little weak. We do a little rehab. 2 weeks later, you're back.
Mm-hmm.
Right? You tear your ACL. Okay, we're going to do surgery on you. This is the rehab protocol, blah, 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 blah. 9 months later, you're back.
Mm-hmm.
When somebody comes into your office and they say, you know what, my hamstring has been bothering me for 3 or 4 months. I've been nursing it. I run a little, it gets worse. I take a couple of weeks off, it gets better, then it gets worse.
No.
I'm telling you, those are the ones that it's the best and the worst. Like as a clinician, when you help people like that, it's amazing.
Yep.
But it's super, super difficult, like to actually to determine what caused that injury. And you'll never know for sure. That's the other thing. You're always going to be guessing.
Yeah.
And, we have our suspects along the way, and we try to, look at all the potential suspects. But I'm telling you, in my clinical experience, if I'm right 50-60% of the time, I'm feeling pretty good about it.
It's good. Yeah. Yeah.
Like it's not an easy thing to do. And this is, maybe spending an hour and a half with somebody, truly having a good conversation with them and going through a whole bunch of testing and asking them questions and trying to jog their memory. And honestly, it could be something as simple as their cleat slipped in their shoe.
Yeah.
Right. And so it slipped out 5 degrees.
Yep.
And they didn't notice. And for the next 1,000 miles, they're pedaling along and one cleat is straight, one cleat is turned. And for the first 1,000 miles, it didn't make a difference. And all of a sudden their hamstring starts to hurt or their knee starts to hurt. And they come into your office and they don't have their bike with them. They don't have their shoes with them. Well, good luck figuring out that 5 degree change was the thing that caused the problem. And so with this paper, they try to get into, what are some of the root causes of these chronic injuries, and so we'll get into some of the conclusions. But that's kind of my takeaway, John.
No, I love it. And so you started, and you asked me what were my initial ideas on what was the root cause of cycling injuries, the overuse injuries, and my first, my non-clinical background. I would immediately look at seat height. I'd look at cleat position. I'd look at how the handlebars are set up, the reach and the height. Those were the first things that I would look at. How about you?
And I would too, right? So that's one of the things that I've done in the past with people that have been cyclists that have had injuries that they wanted me to look at them and help them out. Is I'm like, you got to bring your bike in. Yeah. Or I need video of you on the bike. Bring your shoes in, bring your kit in that you were riding in the same socks, everything. Right. I've even gone so far to say, hey, you know what? You tell me that when it hurts after I ride an hour, I'll say, okay, go ride an hour before you come in. Yeah. Right. Because I can't have you riding in, for an hour as I'm sitting watching you. Yeah. And then, now all of a sudden it starts to hurt. Right. So, but those are that's what ultimately makes things really difficult, because I was like you before I read this paper, that I was thinking those were really important factors. And even though the paper says they're not, which is really the interesting thing, I still think there's something to this. Yeah. So the paper concludes that saddle height, John, what did they say about saddle height and injury?
They weren't good predictors of injury. Now, I want to throw in one more piece. I want to throw it in at the end as well. Cycling should be pain-free. And I posted this on someone, was asking a question about bike fit on our Facebook page. And my number one answer right away, or whenever I get a question like that, is your bike fit should be so you can bike without pain. Numbness is not good. Numbness doesn't need to be happening. Your feet don't need to be painful. Your private parts don't need to be painful. So it takes a while to get that set up, but there's a lot of things that go into it, from how you're riding, what type of terrain you're riding, what type of roads you're riding, But at the end of the day, when you bike, it should not be painful.
So I completely 100% agree with you that, but you have to build that up too, right? Because if
Yeah,
someone doesn't bike at all
that's right.
and they get on a bike, it's gonna be uncomfortable.
That's right.
Like, like, and so we have to slowly build people into that. But if you have somebody that is a chronic bike rider, not a chronic injury, chronic bike rider, let's say in a year they're doing between 3,000 and say 5,000 miles,
Mm-hmm.
which is not atypical.
No, right.
Right? In that case, they should be pain free.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like, I think that's who we're really talking to tonight. Our audience is mostly triathletes that have spent a lot of time biking, and I agree with you. It should be pain free, and running should be pain free,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
and swimming should be pain free.
That's right.
Right? If you're doing these things properly, they should be pain free. Now, I get it. If you have osteoarthritis,
Mm-hmm.
if you've got some kind of degenerative joint disease,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, those are the kind of outliers.
Yeah.
Right. So it's not always going to be pain free. I get that, but
Mm-hmm.
I think the general point that you make is very important.
Yeah.
So this goes against what most bike fitters that I've ever talked to, and I've listened to bike fitting podcasts,
Yeah.
and read a lot of bike fitting material. They're going to tell you, and I'll probably tell you this too,
Yeah.
that hey, if we change this, this, and this, I can take your pain away.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So this is a lesson that I always teach my students when we start early on in their program. Is that we usually start talking about taping feet early.
Mm-hmm.
So like taping people's arches, their toes. We talk a lot about orthotics in shoes. And I said, the problem with all that stuff is, orthotics included, is that if you make a change to somebody, if they're in pain, you make a change, they'll probably feel better.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Interesting.
And so to kind of make this point is, and the truth of the matter is, as humans, we'll also try and make changes to make ourselves feel better.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So I'll take that a step further. If I have let's say we'll take a cyclist here. If I have a cyclist who's the ball of their foot hurts when they're riding, it's not an uncommon thing. If I take a rock, a little tiny rock, and put it like an inch or so away from that, and have them start to cycle, where it was hurting before doesn't hurt anymore.
Right.
It's where the rock starts to hurt. But the interesting thing is, if you let them go about 10 minutes, it won't hurt anymore, because they'll figure out a new movement pattern around that.
Yep.
Right. And it's the same with the bike fit. If I make a change, it feels weird for the first little bit. Right. Earlier this year, we talked about crank arm length, and I changed my crank arm length. And the first 10 minutes, oh, that's a little weird. Then my body just, this is how it is. Yeah. And the weirdest thing is, now on my time trial bike, I have a different crank arm length than my road bike. I don't even notice the difference anymore, because the time trial position, when I'm in that's the crank arm length. So our body is, our masters at kind of overcoming these things. And we have to be very careful when we make changes, especially if we're injured, right? Oh, let's go back to the hamstring and saying, okay, my hamstring is injured. Oh, you know what I need to do? I need to lower my saddle, because you're extending too much, your hamstring's getting pulled. So you lower the saddle and give yourself a few days, let yourself rest, lower your saddle. Your next ride, oh man, that feels good. It must have been the saddle. Must have been the saddle height. And I think what this paper is getting at is, it probably wasn't the saddle height. Now, we'll have to agree that extremes probably will not be good on either end. Obviously, if you can't quite reach the pedal, it's going to be different. But these basically, what we're getting at is, these positional things in biking did not seem to, at least in the review of literature, make a difference in being able to predict who would get injured and who wouldn't.
That's right. And that's what sort of caught me off guard when I read it, because at first in my mind, I knew what the paper was going to be about and what they were going to find. And then it's like, no, there's no relationship between a lot of the things that we think about and injury. So let's talk a little bit about the paper and why we do need to be careful about some of the information we pull from this paper.
Yeah.
So this paper, as you mentioned, was a lit review, a systematic review. And I'm looking at their figure. They found, whoops, where'd it go? They found 3,907 papers that dealing with something related to cycling, something injury. And from that, roughly 4,000 papers, they ultimately whittled it down to, what was it,
24. Oh, sorry.
24.
Oh, no, sorry. Studies excluded with reason, 24. Studies included in quantitative was 18.
18. All right. So they start with this 4,000, number of papers, and they whittle it down to 18. And what they were looking for are papers that probably were the best science.
Yeah.
Oh, there's our first fireworks. So, they're trying to find the best science, and they're trying to eliminate papers that have some inherent recognizable bias. And can you hear that, or is that
Well, I'm having it here too.
Oh, are you? Okay. And now the dogs are starting. Oh. All right. So, and I think that's important to recognize is that this isn't just any paper. Some of the factors that they applied, the filter that they applied was, how people got their subjects in the study, because that's a bias. That if you only look for, if you just do cyclists in Las Vegas, that's too limited. You've got to have a bigger pool to actually really truly understand what's going on, which also causes some problems too, because ultimately I'm just interested in me.
Yeah.
I'm not interested in everybody else and how they respond. So it's always a funny battle that we play here. But they applied a number of different criteria to try to pick the papers that were probably the best to understand this injury, the relationship between factors that predict injury.
Yeah, and in the literature, especially in the prediction game of injury, which I've read quite a few of these systematic reviews, it almost always ends up like this,
Mm-hmm.
where you have thousands of papers and it gets whittled down to the ones that are the highest quality. And
Yep.
they're scoring systems that people use. These people actually went in pretty deep and had a bunch of experts rate if they thought there was bias in the papers or not bias in the papers. And we at some point, I'm sure someone will study this study in more depth.
Right.
But at this point, this is some really good. To me, it's some good stuff, even though it's only looking at 18 papers. But think about that, John. How long would it take you to read 18 papers?
Oh yeah, no, to go into depth on 18 that's a big number actually.
Yeah.
So.
And how many times have we? Maybe not us. Well, I'll say me. I've done it where I've read one paper and I'm like, oh man, that's really interesting, and come to a conclusion on one paper.
Yeah, right.
So it's easy to say, well, they had 3,900 papers to start with, and they whittled it down to 18. It was 18 high quality papers.
That are addressing the problem at hand.
Exactly.
So along the way, what happens, you find good papers, but they don't necessarily add to the question. It may have turned up in a search of cycling and injury, but maybe it really wasn't something specific to the topic. So
yeah, and it could have been, for example, like injury to the breathing or brain injury, which we weren't talking about here. And yeah, so you're spot on there. So that being said, yes, this is an interesting way to do this. And even within the papers they selected, there still was some biases.
Yeah.
And in that ultimately has to be remembered as well, as you're never going to have no bias in research, like absolutely zero bias. And the truth is when they started to look at these papers of all of the possible parameters and symptoms that they came across, that was unbelievable, the number of things that were actually looked at that they came through. Yeah. So it looked at age, height, weight, BMI, sex, if they smoked or not, how they trained on hills, how much experience they had they had a bike fit before, did they have an injury before, did they ride in the drops, did they ride more aero, how much range of motion at every single joint, could they do a tuck jump, like so many factors.
Yeah.
Well, it wasn't that they just said, oh, you know what, we're going to look at these few factors. they looked at, to me, were if someone was to come up with an idea of why you get injured more or not, they came up with a lot of factors
Yep.
that they tried to pull out of the literature and determine what ultimately caused it. And like, we'll go back to it. The first thing they came up with, the first notable thing to me was that bike position was not a big factor.
No, it was odd. That was
Yeah.
interesting and odd at the same time. That was.
Now, that being said, it's an easy thing to change, right? So if your knee's bothering you and you change your saddle height by a couple of millimeters and your knee feels better and the pain never comes back, okay, go with it. I'm
Yeah.
not, it's not like it's a difficult thing to change. One that's obviously a hard thing to change. You can't change your age, right? Like, but age wasn't a factor, which was also interesting. So,
Well, and one of the, we got to put an asterisk against on this entirely because these are all road bikes.
Yeah.
And so this is not a review of being on your time trial bike or your tri bike.
Yeah.
And so that although
they did road bikes, commuter bikes,
yep.
and mountain bikes.
Yep.
Yeah. There was nothing with time trial bikes.
And there just won't be enough in that world of triathlon and injuries that triathletes have, chronic injuries that triathletes have. Now, so that sort of threw me for a loop. I wrote down body parameters, no relationship between overuse symptoms and body function, posture, including hip, knee angles, and core muscles. That one was like, oh, wow, that was one of those obvious ones I was expecting to read. And they came up and they said, there's actually not enough evidence or any evidence to really say that there's a relationship between these body parameters and overuse injuries.
But the interesting thing is this, and this is where I love this paper so much, is because it is only talking about injury, right? It's not saying that this is going to make you like these things, if you tweak them the right way, won't make you more powerful on the bike.
Yeah, that's right. That's a good point.
Right?
Or that you're going to be faster. Yeah.
You'll be faster. Well, they're not taking that into account. And then and so that's important to remember as well, especially in our world, right? Because a time trial position can be extremely fast.
Yep.
And not cause you not cause you injury, but not very comfortable. And then it ultimately ends up not being very fast. Right.
Right.
So I do think that is an interesting thing and I'm glad that they didn't mention that, right? Because we're really only trying to talk about the injury.
So then the next one I wrote down, bike measures.
Yes.
No relationship between any bike, body load parameter, and overuse symptoms. I was like, oh, that's another one I was expecting.
But the bike measures, the one thing interesting about bike measures, they did have moderate evidence to support less perineal symptoms and less erectile dysfunction with the saddle cutout.
That's right. That's right.
And so even more in particular, when that was with this thing was later down on the paper, but it was on mountain bikes in particular. Yeah. But for road cyclists, I think if you're going to spend any time in the saddle, you really should be thinking about, if you're a man, thinking about these, and even for women with perineal symptoms, a saddle cutout, to me just seems like you should, that is the cost of doing business. You should have that.
Yep. And I think, fortunately, there was someone in town that was trying to open up sort of more of a saddle testing business. And so I was able to go connect with them, and I was able to try out like 20 saddles. They all had quick release. She just switched them out real fast. And, I was looking at one, I'm like, oh, that's going to be the one. Try it. No, that's not the one. Okay, let's try this one. Okay. And eventually you get to, or I got to a saddle where I'm like, hey, this one, this is great. I don't feel any pain. But that, took going through 20 saddles. And there's not a lot of people that have that opportunity to do that.
Yeah. And the interesting thing also, there was, on that one also, there was a little bit of conflicting evidence between symptoms and then including saddle tilt, saddle width, saddle height, and saddle firmness. And when we see conflicting evidence, it means that some research said one thing, some said another. So there's a possibility that those things could potentially lead to chronic injury.
And that's exactly what I wrote down too, is saddle height, tilt width, saddle firmness was conflicting information, which tells me that not all cyclists have found the right saddle. That doesn't mean the right saddle doesn't exist. It means you haven't tried and found that right saddle. So I think that's again,
Exactly.
that's this, we've talked about group versus individual ideas here. And this is one where the individual really needs to find the right saddle that fits for them on their bike and the way that they ride their bike.
Yeah. And if you know people in town like me, I have a box of saddles,
Yeah,
and I'll lend it out to anybody who wants to try my box of saddles
right,
because
right.
I've went through a lot to finally find the ones that work for me.
Yeah, yeah,
And
that's good.
if you were to post on, like, whatever town you're in, or if you're in Las Vegas, on the, Tri Club page, hey, does anyone have any saddles I could try? You'll be surprised. People will be willing to let you try. And there's a lot of the bike shops, even online and local bike shops, will let you
Yeah.
try saddles,
Hmm.
because
Yeah,
it's the only real way is you got to get out and you got to ride 100 miles on a saddle, in my experience, minimum, before you really recognize that this is good or not, because different often, like we said,
yep,
will feel weird,
yep.
and if you're in pain, it might actually take your pain away for a little bit.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, and that's where I was really lucky to have this person who had the quick release set up to be able to change them out so quickly. It was really pretty sweet.
Yeah.
Okay, so the one that caught my eye as well was load.
Yeah, but we've
And
talked about this a lot.
I know, and I like this one, and I want to circle back to some of the running injury work that we've done as well. But load, they did conclude that there was a relationship between training, racing load. I'm just reading my notes here. Participating in an event and an increase in symptoms.
Yeah.
So, and I think they were relating that to the load. And again, this is load. How do you quantify load? I think they were looking more in terms of volume.
Yeah, the more
Cycle.
load, the more load, the better chance of injury. And if in the discussion part, they were talking about unaccustomed load, I think was the word they used.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Right. So, and we've talked a lot about this before, and we I guess now's probably a good time as any to talk about acute chronic training loads,
yeah.
and what you're used to. Your chronic training load, if you're used to riding 200 miles a week and you ride 200 miles a week every week, and you don't make any changes to it, you're not going to get much faster, but you probably aren't going to get injured.
Yep, yep.
Right? It's the person that goes 100 miles a week. Oh man, I got a race coming up in 6 weeks, and then I'm going to do 200 miles a week every week until the race. They're they're way more susceptible to be injured, or they're only training. And this is one of the articles that they actually reviewed was from a 6-day stage race,
Mm-hmm,
and the people, no one had that kind of load before, right?
mm-hmm.
You weren't riding 100 miles a day for 6 days in a row as an age grouper, and so the injury numbers were a little bit higher in that case. Well, it makes sense, right? You're taking a training load that is multiples more, I guess, of load than they would have been training with.
Mm-hmm. No, I love it. Well, and now let me draw the parallel to our running world.
Yeah.
In our running world, runners get injured at a very high rate, and there's been a lot of research on why. And again, we're speaking of overuse type of injuries, and you can put it down to it's biomechanics, it's how someone moves, it's the environment that they're moving in, and it's their or the experience that they have running, and it's their morphology. And you can sort of put things into those bins to understand injuries, but and that's from some classic work by James Bates and Osternig. Uh, but Alan Hurljack, someone else I knew who was a faculty member when I was doing my PhD work, he actually came out with a statement which really holds true. And he said, all injuries are related to training mistakes.
Yep.
And
It's
so,
100% true, because if you
yeah,
sit on
and
the
so
couch, you don't get injured.
that's right. His point, that's right. His point was, if you've got a certain morphology, Well, you can run within that morphology, but once you exceed a certain amount that morphology can handle, you're going to get injured. Or if you run with the wrong shoes, if you run, if you overdo it, you're going to get injured. And so, in essence, everything was training related injuries, and that's what immediately drew me back on this load part. Is yeah, that makes sense that it's hard to tease out saddle height, uh, reach, stack, whatever it is without accounting for the load that you're getting.
Yeah.
So if you if you just sit on your bike and you don't bike much, you're not going to get injured.
Yeah, if your saddle height is too high, but you only do 10 miles a week,
Yeah, that's no big
right?
deal. You're probably going
How
to be
many
okay.
times have you been driving around town or riding around town, and you see somebody on a BMX bike and their saddle is like this high, right? And their hands are like this, and they're not worried about a chronic injury now, are they? Right? Because
Well,
they're riding a 7-Eleven and back.
let's take it, to places where we've traveled in the world. Copenhagen, Japan. I have two big areas where there's lots of bike riding for commuting,
Yeah.
and their saddle heights are so low because they're commuting. They're stopping at lights or putting their feet down. So they do not have a bike fit that's optimized for performance, but yet their cycling injury, and I don't know
But it might
now.
be optimized for injury.
Well, that's right. And so I'm speaking without any authority here. I have no idea what the injury rates are for commuting in Copenhagen or Japan,
Yeah. No,
but people do it.
it's so true. And and the thing that I'm fascinated by is why, and this is some cool stuff coming out with genetic research, is why some people get injured more than others and why
Yeah,
some people
yeah,
can handle more load than others.
hmm yeah.
So I was just listening to a podcast earlier this week with Molly Seidel's coach. So for those of you that don't know, she was the American girl that got third in the Olympics in the marathon, in only her second marathon, right? It's pretty amazing. And he said, you know what, this girl, she could not train for a month and just roll out of bed and do a 100-mile week and not get injured,
hmm
right? He had other athletes, pro athletes, that 60, 70 miles was their limit.
Yeah.
And, in her Olympic buildup, she was doing 140, 150, 160 miles a week running.
hmm
And that would just destroy
Yeah.
other people. And, in the world of athletic training, I have a really hard time teaching this to my students and teaching it to athletes, because they're like, well, my friend John Mercer, he rides this amount of miles per week and he runs this amount and he doesn't seem to get injured.
Right.
But I try and do that and I built up slow and I can't get past doing this amount or I get injured. It, unfortunately, a lot of it is genetic.
Yeah.
And you need to, if you want to stay injury free, you need to figure out what the load that you can handle is. And in triathlon, it is so hard to figure that out. The really only way to figure it out is to get injured.
Yeah, right.
And then look back at your data retrospectively. And this is why you say you keep good training logs, is look back and be like, okay, yes, here's where my limit is. If I stay at this level, I don't get injured. If I push it, even if I push it up slowly, I get injured.
Yeah.
And there's something to that. And it takes a very astute athlete. And if they're working with a coach, a very astute coach, to figure that out. And honestly, John, it's going to take your whole career.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because I feel like I'm pretty astute and I still get injured.
Yeah, that's right. It's hard. It's hard to avoid these injuries, but that's because of this repetition. Like we talked about right in the beginning. 80 RPM. If you just sustain that, you go for a 6-hour ride. I got to do the math in my head real quick. 6 times 60 times 80. That's a big number, and that's a lot of repetitions for the same movement with your foot roughly fixed on the pedal. In this case, for cycling, your body and depending on the course that you're doing, we're trying to always be in aero position, so you're trying to maintain the same position for as long as you can.
I would contend that, okay, so your 6-hour ride that you just talked about, I would contend that there are many people, including myself, that a 6-hour flight, I'm just sitting there, I'm not doing anything. I get up and I'm like, oh, and I am stiff and sore. And if someone said, "Hey, can you go for a run right now?" I wouldn't want to go for a run right now, but oh, I'm a triathlete, so I got to go do a 6 hour bike ride,
No,
and now I'm going to run for a half hour off of that.
that's a
So,
great point.
and if you just think about that, or think about it if you had a bike that was completely, it was passive moving, so it was an engine, and you just clipped your feet in there, okay, and you clipped your feet in for 6 hours and had this thing spin
Hmm.
at 80 RPM,
Yep,
and you just sat there and you didn't do any muscle contraction at all,
yep,
you'd be sore afterwards,
yep, that's right.
right? And maybe even injured,
Yeah, right.
right?
Well, and I think that that's interesting. I think, I see more of a movement for indoor cycling trainers to have more movement
Yeah.
rather than just a fixed bike. And I think that I actually think that has been that plays into injury prevention. And I like it, when I see people saying, "Oh, I'm going to go ride my road bike." I think that's great because now you're changing things, letting the body get used to another situation, which ultimately I think does help with injury prevention. It's hard to put our thumb on any data that support that, but the idea is that you're training your muscles to contract for cycling in a variety of different ways and not just the same way all the time.
But also we contend that's the beauty of triathlon, right?
Hmm. Yeah.
Is we actually have three different sports as well, right?
Hmm.
And I contend that if I was just a cyclist, just a runner, just a swimmer, well, I know for sure I couldn't do the training volume.
Hmm.
Right? Can you imagine running 20 hours a week?
Yeah.
I mean, I know people that do it.
Hmm.
I don't think my body couldn't
Right. Right.
couldn't withstand that. So we're in some ways we're really fortunate that we do a sport that is really three sports.
Hmm. No, that's good. All right, so I wrote down another note here, and it's sort of along what we're talking about right now. One of the reasons why cycling research in particular is really tough to do is because when you change one parameter, like seat height, if you're looking for the influence of something like seat height on something else, if you change seat height, you really need to make some adjustments in other parts of the bike as well. And not all research studies will make those other adjustments. And so now you're looking at a change in something. Again, there could be maybe it's a change in cleat position. You
Yeah.
change cleat position, you still really need to adjust both your reach and your fore aft and your saddle or whatever it is. And that's not always done. And so this is just hard research to do.
Well, it depends what you're looking at, right? Because if you're just looking at just changing seat height, you actually don't have to change anything else,
Yeah.
right?
Hmm.
Because that's what kind of getting down to the research. Like if we took 20 people into the lab and said, okay, we're going to raise your saddle either a centimeter or lower it a centimeter, and
Hmm.
didn't change anything else, that's the thing we're measuring is the seat height, but everything else changed around it,
Yeah.
right? And
Right. Right.
that's where it's actually difficult is now your hip angle is different, your shoulder angle is different, your wrist angle is different, your knee angle is different, all these things are different, and you can't, in my opinion, you couldn't account for all those things,
Right,
and
right.
so you
Well,
have to.
but that's exactly, that's the crux of the problem is because
Exactly.
then if you do see a difference in this so-called seat height change, it may not actually be the height of the seat that caused the change. It may be that your reach is different
Yep.
or your hip angle is different. So it may not actually, and so this is the challenge of this type of work
Yeah,
is,
it's super challenging.
uh,
No, I completely agree. And, and I don't know, you probably the same as me. Like I mess around with my saddle height all the time.
yeah,
I'm like,
right.
oh, millimeter here, millimeter here. So that
Mm.
feels, especially if I'm trying something a little different. I'm always tinkering. Like,
Oh, I do not
yes.
touch my seat height at all. I don't touch it at
Oh, I do all
all.
the time.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. Yeah, no, I don't even want to take my seat post off. I know you do for your
Oh,
for
I take my seat post off every time I put it in the car.
yeah, yeah.
I take, and I have it marked. Like, I keep it relatively the same for a long time.
Hmm.
Um, but I've definitely changed it. I changed my cranks, then I'll change the seat post.
Interesting. Yeah.
Um, I'm like, well, and I actually just recently on my road bike, I just changed the tilt of my seat a little bit, and
Wow.
I'm a tinkerer, and yeah, I don't know, maybe it's not a good thing to
I love
do.
it. Yeah, so I'm not, and I've got a position that I'm comfortable in. I'm not having any injuries, and I'm like, I'm not gonna touch it. I'll go ride my mountain bike. I'll go ride a road bike, but I won't touch my and I have two different bikes I run. I have one bike mounted on the trainer, and I have my bike for the outdoor. I wish they were the same frame, but they're not. But they're pretty close in fit. But I
So what
also
do you do when
don't.
you get a new pair of shoes and they're slightly thicker? You,
I don't change my shoes out unless they're. I'm probably about 4 years in on this pair of shoes. So,
oh, John, you're blowing my mind. So
but I've gone
I
through
mean,
that. But it's interesting because that's the problem for me is changing out my shoes is getting my cleat position correct. So what I'll do when I do buy new shoes, I'll put another set of cleats on those, but I'll keep my original one. I will not take those cleats off, and I will. Yeah, so I'll keep them on there. But
but
changing the cleat out, I have to
cleat
do
position
that.
doesn't, we just learned that cleat position doesn't make a difference in
I
injury.
know it doesn't,
So this
but
is
I can
psychological
feel it.
maybe.
Oh, it's
So,
cool.
John, I probably cycle through 4 different pairs of shoes
Mhm.
at any given time,
Yeah,
cycling shoes.
great, great.
And like just on this trip I'm on now, I've got 2 different pairs of cycling shoes.
Okay,
And even when I did my Everest, I switched my shoes halfway through.
that's right. That's right.
And I've got different shoes I have on the trainer. I've got, yeah, I've got commuting shoes.
Oh, that's good. And I think that's the right way to go. Now, I do have two pairs of shoes. I do have my shoes for sprint racing for sure.
Yeah.
They are different than my long distance. But it's interesting when I think I told this story. I went camping and I took my bike with me, but I forgot my bike shoes. And
Oh,
so I said, okay, well, I'm just going to go ride in my running shoes, but I'm only going to limit how far I'm going to ride because of this whole thing that we're talking about. That's a big change to, bike and running shoes. I didn't want to introduce a new stress and a new injury at that point.
yeah,
So
because now we're talking about load, right? It's
that's
not,
right.
it's not the change, it's
Right.
the load.
You got to
Right.
find the right amount of load you can do for that change. And that was,
Exactly.
and given bike running shoes are quite different than bike shoes. My sense was the load should not be that high for that.
So let me ask you a question, and then maybe I'll be devil's advocate. So if you get your cleat in the exact spot that you know is good for you,
hmm
do you feel that if you went, I don't know, let's say we're talking rotation, you went 2 degrees one way, 2 degrees the other way, that would be a problem for you?
Um, my brain would say and my rational side will say I'll adapt and just give me time. I just need to introduce that reasonable. So I'm not going to make that change in 2 degrees and then go for a 100-mile ride. I'm going to make that change and then I'm going to bike 20 miles here, 20 miles here, and then build up to that 100 miles.
Okay. So my theory would be like, and part of the reason that I'm not so sold on this whole cleat position being exact all the time
hmm
is if I think about my kneecap in particular, because I seem to have knee issues more than
hmm
anything. And I think of like the underside of my kneecap and
Right.
it fitting into the femur. If I'm in the exact same position over and over and over again,
Right.
am I actually potentially, I know stress is good and
hmm
amounts of stress are good, but am I potentially wearing down the cartilage
That's
in
right.
that one spot too much? And so that's one of the reasons I like to vary my shoes
Yeah.
is I feel like I'm actually saving my knees more
hmm
than I am, I don't know, maybe potentially causing other problems.
No, I think you're spot on, and I 100% agree with that. But the pedals I have both rotation and float, and
Uh,
so I actually,
so it's coming from somewhere then.
yeah, that's right. So because for that same reason, I've never liked the pedals where your foot is fixed and it can't move.
Oh
That
yeah,
I think is
I can't
really, I
stand
think
that.
that's dangerous. And so the pedals I have a good amount of leeway, which is perfect for long distance triathlon. If I'm doing a crit race, okay, maybe that's a little bit different type of shoe pedal interface you want. But for the type of cycling that we do, having some play in the cleat is a good thing.
So I'm going to ask you one more question. I know we're getting a little long here.
Yeah.
This one's going to maybe, it might pull off an old wound though. Is that okay?
Okay, let's hear
It's just because I know you so well.
it.
So you tackled the Norseman,
Yep. Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. Right.
not on your own bike,
No, that's right. Now I see where you're going. Right.
right? Did you get injured from the
Oh
bike?
my gosh, I did. Yeah, I could barely walk the next day.
Oh,
My
was it because of the bike?
but not during the race. I was
Okay.
able, I didn't have anything, but yes, the next day, my knee especially was in more pain than I had ever experienced before. But I did race a sprint race, whatever, 2, 3 weeks after
Yeah.
that.
So
So,
he wasn't really injured.
yeah,
And it could have been that 26 mile up that mountain.
maybe that had something to do with
Or it could have
it.
been, was it how many meters of climbing on the bike? Like
I
10,000.
don't know. Yeah, it was a
I mean, there's a
little.
lot of things it could have been. It might have been the bike.
Yeah.
It might have been the bike. But also, so that load wasn't probably enough to truly cause you injury
Hmm.
in that, because, I'm sure you tried to get that bike dialed in as close as you could, but I'm sure it wasn't.
Yeah, no, it was different, but that's yeah, like you do try to convince yourself the logical side of you is you'll adapt to it,
Yeah.
and that's what I just kept saying. I can get through this. I can get through 112 miles on this bike, and I did. I never had an injury that made me want to stop. Almost a broken cable, but
Yeah.
that's
So
another story.
when I've rented bikes when we've traveled and I've borrowed people's bikes when we've traveled, I definitely set myself a limit.
Yeah,
It's like,
yeah.
I don't really want to do more than, let's say, 60 miles
Hmm.
in a day, right? Or if I
Hmm.
had my own bike,
Yeah,
I would potentially go a little further. But it's funny because at 60 miles, I started to feel things that I haven't felt before.
right.
And there's a certain level of uncomfortable, a little uncomfortable feeling that you have. And yeah, I think it's pretty interesting. Getting exactly dialed in
Yeah.
it's pretty hard unless you bring a tape measure,
Hmm.
and even still, you have to have the same saddle and the
Yeah.
same handlebars, the same,
Same shorts, same, yeah. Yeah. Now,
everything.
when I do travel and rent, I take my own pedals for my shoes as well. You do the same, right?
I do the same.
Yeah.
Yeah, because at least you can kind of handle that one interface. But it really is realistically, you probably should take your own saddle.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because it's not that hard to change out a saddle.
No.
But interesting. Well, John, hey, I really enjoyed this paper. Thank you so much for finding this one, and you're amazing. I mean, this thing came out 2 days ago.
But yeah, well, actually, our colleague Brian sent it to me,
Yep.
and he's always on the lookout for good papers like that. So that was nice to get that alert.
Awesome. Well, John, I hope you have an awesome new year, and the training calendar starts again tomorrow, and you're ready to roll.
That's right. And hopefully that was the only fireworks tonight, but I know it won't be. But
It's really interesting. It started raining pretty hard here,
oh, okay, that's good.
and that's a good thing, right? Because no one's going outside lighting off their fireworks in the rain. And we were actually really hoping that would be the case. It would just pour all night. It's actually supposed to rain really hard all night, so
Yeah.
kind of looking forward to
Love the fireworks, except when we have dogs. That's poor
that. Or
dog.
except for if I want to sleep.
Yeah, yeah.
All right, John.
Hey,
Well, that was awesome. We'll talk to
good
you next
talking.
week.
All right, sounds good.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye bye.